Hello to everyone, and thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Dobar dan svima u regionu I hvala vam puno što slušate ovo izlaganje. I want to start by thanking Tanja Topic of the Frederick Ebert Stiftung organization in Banja Luka for the invitation to present this short talk about the limits and possibilities of using monuments to promote reconciliation. My talk today will be organized into three parts, which are based on a research project that I've been conducting about monuments built in memory of civilian victims of the Second World War in Northwest Bosnia. In the first part, I want to take us back nearly 40 years to the summer and autumn of 1981 and tell you a story about two monuments that were unveiled in Northwest Bosnia that year. Second, I want to explain how these monuments, which were designed to promote the remembrance of the war, actually helped to physically enshrine silences about two of the war's most traumatic events in this part of Bosnia. Third, I'll offer some reflections about how such communist-created silences did not contribute to reconciliation, as well as how more recent forms of remembrance in this region have similar limitations when it comes to attaining that objective. I'll finish by suggesting that in order to increase the chances for reconciliation to take place, monuments that reinforce mutually existing myths, which have been built in the region since at least 1945, should be replaced by those that promote mutually coexisting truths. And to illustrate my position, I'll offer an imaginative sketch of what that might look like in one of the cases that I'll be discussing. But before we get to that subject, let's take a journey back to July 27th, 1981. The place is a site of gentle rolling hills in the shadow of the mountains that divide northwest Bosnia from Croatia, located just a few kilometers outside the Bosnian town of Bihać, which spans the emerald green waters of the Una River. On this hot summer day, thousands of people gathered at a place which locals called, and still call, Garavice, which is the site you see here in this photograph. Here's a view of the crowd that gathered at Garavice on July 27, 1981, as seen in a newspaper article in the local paper, Krajina. Those in the crowd had come to take part in the unveiling of a large monument in memory of what the communist authorities referred to as victims of fascist terror, or civilian victims of the Second World War in the region, which began in 1941 and lasted until 1945. During the late 1970s, the local communist authorities collected funds in order to construct a memorial on this site. The Belgrade architect, Bogdan Bogdanovic, who designed the memorial at the former concentration camp of Jasenovac, as well as many others, was selected by the local authorities in Bihać to design the monument at Garavice. It was to be situated on top of a hill and would be composed of a series of 15 towering abstract stone structures that would represent women. For Bogdanovic, the choice of the female figure was a way of injecting an element of hope and a sense of rebirth into the memorial. In his words, quote, "I chose the woman as a symbol of life," end quote. The female figures were to be positioned in such a way that they appeared to be watching over the rest of the site, which was to be, quote, "a great field of victims," end quote. Standing high on the hill, they were to act as a bridge between the dark days of the war and the light of the future. This is a photograph of the site while it was still under construction. And here is a photo of what the sculptures looked like during one of my many research trips in the region. The monument's emphasis on the future rather than the past was made most evident by a plaque, which was placed at the entrance to a path that would lead visitors upward toward the abstract female figures. Here is a photograph of that plaque. For those who do not read the local language, the inscription reads as, "Life is stronger than death. Justice is stronger than crimes. Love is stronger than hatred." The opening of the memorial park at Garavice was planned to coincide with July 27, 1981, the day which marked the 40th anniversary of the communist-led insurgency in the region. The main speaker at the ceremony was Hamdia Pozderac, who at the time was a member of the Central Committee of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia and the most influential political personality from the region. In his speech, he explained what the authorities wished to communicate through the memorial park. Quote, "In our country, there are many regions and places where the fascist occupiers and domestic traitors committed unprecedented atrocities against innocent people of all nations and nationalities. One of those was Garavice, which by number of patriots killed is among the largest sites of mass killing and fascist evil deeds. Here on this place, the Ustashes and the Germans carried out genocide against the innocent Serb population, as well as against politically advanced Muslim and Croat workers, citizens and youth, and a number of Jews of Bihać and the surrounding region," end quote. His formulation, which portrayed the victims killed at Garavice as a multi-ethnic group, paved the way for the central purpose of his speech, to emphasize the wartime development of brotherhood and unity. In his words, quote, "The idea of brotherhood and unity and full national equality became the foundation of our national liberation struggle and an essential component of the strategy of the Communist Party in the Socialist Revolution. It was, as Tito emphasized, one of the main sources of our strength and the guarantee of our victories." The essential message here was that people of all national backgrounds were killed, yet the mass killings helped to compel them to join together to fight against and ultimately defeat those who sought to destroy others on the basis of their nationality. Just over 3 months later, on November 3rd, 1981, another monument was unveiled in this same region of Bosnia. It was built in a small town called Kulen-Vakuf, which, like Bihać, straddles the emerald green waters of the Una River and is located 50 kilometers south of that city. Here is a picture of Kulen-Vakuf that I took during one of my research trips there over the past years. At 1 p.m. on November 3rd, 1981, several hundred people assembled at the site of the newly constructed monument, which was located immediately next to the town's primary school. And soon the unveiling ceremony began. This day was the culmination of several years of work by local partisans, or communist war veterans, who had founded a council for building the monuments in Kulen-Vakuf in 1978. After collecting funds from local socio-political organizations and citizens, they turned to a young architect from Bihać named Sadeta Ibrahim Pasic to design the monument. Her instructions were simple: design a monument for the region's partisan fighters, or fallen fighters, Pali Borci, as they were known at the time. The monument's main theme was to be the brotherhood and unity of these fighters, and a list of their names needed to be carved on the plaques. Ibrahim Pasic chose the symbol of a closed flower as the main motif for the monument. The site she envisioned would be circular. In its center would stand a large flower representing Yugoslavia. Surrounding it would be 8 smaller flowers, each representing the 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces in the Yugoslav Federation. 4 plaques would be positioned on the ground facing upwards at north-south and east-west positions, and carved on them would be the names of 147 fallen fighters from the region. Here is a photo of work being done to complete the monument during the autumn of 1981. The monument would be a memorial to the partisans from the region and would connect their deaths to the birth of a new socialist Yugoslavia and the equality of all nationalities in brotherhood and unity. Here is a photo of local school children in Kulen-Vakuf working to complete the monument during the summer of 1981. At 1 p.m. on November 3rd, 1981, a group of partisan veterans from the region, dressed in suits and ties, stood in the front row of the crowd opposite a podium, which was positioned next to the monument. They held wreaths. Many relatives of the partisans whose names were carved on the 4 plaques were present. The region's cultural artistic society was dressed in folk costumes, and a number of them held hands and began to dance the Coulon, the circular dance spinning around the monument. Others sang songs. Young men and teenagers climbed onto rooftops of nearby houses to get a better view. Here is a photo of how the ceremony looked that day in Kulen-Vakuf. Among those who gave speeches was a retired general in the Yugoslav People's Army whose name was Hairo Kulenovic, who was originally from the region. In his speech, he stressed the contribution of the people of Kulen-Vakuf and its neighboring villages to the People's Liberation War. They had answered the call of Tito and the Communist Party to join the battle for liberation. Quote, "They wrote with their blood the most celebrated pages of our history and forged the greatest legacy of our revolution, the brotherhood and unity of our nations and nationalities." End quote. In one sense, the construction of the monuments at Garavice and in Kulen-Vakuf in 1981 were simply another reflection of the massive effort by various groups in Yugoslavia to publicly memorialize aspects of the war which the Communist Party felt younger generations needed to know and remember. Already by 1961, more than 14,000 monuments had been built across the country, or an average of nearly 7 per day, every day, since 1947, which was the year when partisan veteran organizations were established and began engaging in such work. By 1981, the number of memorials had grown exponentially beyond that already enormous figure. To many, both at that time and perhaps today, the memory of the Second World War seemed to be everywhere, and so the monuments at Garavice and in Kulen-Vakuf may appear to be nothing exceptional. But what was striking about so many of these monuments was not just their number and overwhelming presence. It was also the deafening silences that they physically enshrined about various indigestible aspects of the war's intercommunal violence. We can look again at the monuments at Garavice and in Kulen-Vakuf and ask, what aspects of the war's violence did these sites of memory help to silence? During the late spring and summer of 1941, Garavice was not, in fact, a place where all supposed nations and nationalities had been killed, which is what the 1981 monument sought to suggest. Garavice was a place where local Ustashas in Bihać, under the direction of Ljubomir Kvaternik, had carried out the killing of thousands of victims because they considered them to be Serbs. Others of different ethnic and political categories were killed at this site, but it was primarily a site where people of one perceived nationality, that is Serbian, were killed on a mass scale. Less than a decade after these killings took place, local citizens built a small monument at Garavice. While it lacked artistic content, this modest monument came much closer to capturing the historical truth of what took place in 1941 than what the local communist authorities built in 1981. Here's a picture of that monument. And here is a photo of the plaque on it. The monument's inscription, which cannot be easily seen in this photograph, reads as follows. Quote, "The people of the region and town of Bihać build this monument as a lasting memory of the 12,000 innocent Serbs who were brutally murdered by the Ustaša evildoers from June until October 1941. End quote. The number of 12,000 victims was almost certainly a significant exaggeration. Like the number of 700,000 victims at Jasenovac, this figure materialized in the first years after the war without any documentation. At Garavice, some preliminary work was done during the early 1950s to exhume the remains of the victims killed there, which would have helped determine a more accurate figure. But this work was halted soon after it began due to a lack of funds. Regardless of the exaggerated nature of the proposed number of victims, the documentation produced by the Regional Commission for Investigating War Crimes suggests that the number of those killed by local Ustašas at Garavice was indeed in the thousands. And they were killed because the Ustašas in Bihać wanted to cleanse the region of everything they defined as Serbian. Given the nature of the violence at Garavice during 1941, the monument built there in 1981 silenced the specifically ethnicized dimension of the killings. Instead, it helped to construct a myth about how people of all national categories were victims at this site. In the case of the monument built in Kulen-Vakuf, the silences that it propagated were even more striking. They can be best appreciated when we examine this photograph, which was taken on the day the monument was unveiled. The speaker at the podium is Nikola Karanovic, a retired general in the Yugoslav People's Army. He was a local commander of insurgents in the Kulen-Vakuf region, many of whom eventually became partisans. He was also a commander of a group of fighters who, along with many others, attacked a column of men, women, and children on September 6, 1941. Nearly all of those in the column were Muslims from Kulen-Vakuf and its surrounding villages, and they were attempting to flee to Bihać. They left their region after about 110 local Ustašas had carried out waves of massacres earlier in the summer against their Orthodox neighbors, which resulted in hundreds of deaths. On September 6, 1941, the fighters under Nikola Karanovic's command participated in a series of revenge massacres against their Muslim neighbors, in which they killed about 2,000 people during a 48-hour period. Many of their victims were women and children. Hundreds of men and boys were thrown into this pit. And rather than be killed by their neighbors, hundreds of women who were trapped on a bridge in Kulen-Vakuf over the Una threw their children and then themselves into the rushing waters, where nearly all drowned. This is a photograph of the river from that bridge. Yet on November 3rd, 1981, when the monument in Kulen-Vakuf was unveiled, General Karanovic did not mention this shocking violence during the summer of 1941, which was by far the most significant wartime event in the region. Instead, he only spoke of the 147 fallen partisan fighters and their contribution to building brotherhood and unity. Watching and listening to him that day in the crowd were survivors of these massacres and their children, but they stood in silence. None of them mentioned the traumatic history they had been living with since 1941. As such, rather than promote the remembrance of cataclysmic local wartime events, the monument in Kulen-Vakuf helped to enshrine silence about the traumatic history of intercommunal killing in this small town on the Una River. These silences that the monuments at Garavice and Kulen-Vakuf helped to enshrine certainly did not promote reconciliation. which can be defined as the act of restoring harmony or friendly relations. The local communist authorities, like those throughout Yugoslavia, were not interested in using monuments to deal with difficult histories of intercommunal violence, nor were the monuments they built to be used to promote reconciliation in communities torn apart by such violence. As Viet Thanh Nguyen has written in his study of Vietnam and the memory of the war in that country, quote, "All wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory," end quote. One could say something similar about intercommunal violence, which is first perpetrated in people's homes and communities, and then frequently a second time in the struggle to remember or to silence what took place. In Yugoslavia, the communist authorities sought to use monuments in their struggle to promote a self-serving vision of the intercommunal violence of 1941 to 1945. This meant that the only elements from the violent past that could be memorialized were those that could help the communists promote their political agenda, which included the critical importance of brotherhood and unity and the heroism of partisan fighters. The memories that threatened this vision of the violent past had to be silenced. One can easily understand why the communists would take this approach. Pointing out the politics that underpinned their monument building is not meant to judge them harshly. It is merely to help discern what their monument sought to accomplish. But such an approach cannot be considered as a just form of memory, and as such, it certainly could not form the basis for any kind of substantive and lasting reconciliation. A just memory, as Nguyen has written, must be based on recalling one's own past as well as that of others. In his words, quote, "Just memory is only possible when the weak, poor, marginalized, the different, and the demonized, or their advocates, can influence or even seize the industries of memory," end quote. Recalling one's own traumatic past and that of others is no easy task. And many people, if not most, will reject this proposition, especially those who have been victimized by their neighbors in small communities. But reconciliation can only take place through recognition of our common humanity, which means that our point of departure must be to accept and embrace that in each one of us, drawing here once again on Nguyen, the quote, "human inhabits the inhuman," end quote. Before I finish, I want to invite you to join me in imagining how the present day monument landscape might change in one of the cases that I've been discussing if we were to try and apply the ideas of a just memory. The objective in doing so would be to try and move away from using monuments to promote mutually exclusive myths and toward using them to make space for mutually coexisting truths. Let's turn our attention once again to the town of Kulen-Vakuf. After the end of the most recent war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a group of local residents in Kulen-Vakuf decided to remove the monument to the fallen partisans that had been built in 1981. They felt that it honored the memory of individuals who had killed members of their families and neighbors, and so they brought in construction tools and heavy machinery and razed that site to the ground. A home for orphan children has since been built on that location. For years, the town was without any monument in memory of those killed during 1941 and 1945, as well as during 1992 to 1995. In the summer of 2004, a group of local residents gathered at the bridge where the women threw their children and then themselves to their deaths. They recalled a version of what took place in September 1941, and then they unveiled a plaque which was bolted to the rock hillside. Here is a photo of it. The inscription reads, "On this bridge in September 1941, insurgent units committed genocide against the Bosniaks of the Ljutoch Valley, and the bridge was destroyed by Chetniks in 1995. The words on this plaque constituted the first public memorial about one part of the mass killings that took place in Kulen-Vakuf in 1941, and as such, they broke the public silence about that violence, at least when it came to the building of monuments. Yet while this monument broke the silence about part of what took place in 1941, it simultaneously created new silences. Specifically, this monument suggests that the only violence worth remembering from that year concerns what happened to one specific group, the emphasis on which does not do justice to the historical record. In creating such a silence, this contemporary monument is similar to what was built in 1981. And just like that monument, the current monument is a poor basis on which to try and cultivate not only reconciliation, but even a general sense of historical truth about what took place in this corner of Bosnia in 1941. In pursuit of trying to sketch out what a more just form of memory that terrible year in this region might look like through the building of monuments, I want to finish by inviting you to join me in imagining a different landscape of memory. This would be one that is built in such a way to help avoid creating silences by employing the notion that we must not only recall our own traumatic memory, but also those of others, that we must remember not in black and white, but in shades of interconnected gray. So, if we imagine that we are now standing on the bridge in Kulen-Vakuf, looking at this plaque, we could now turn our heads to the right. There, just beyond the bridge, we would see a house and a cafe, which are visible in this photograph. This is the house where in the spring and summer of 1941 lived a man named Miroslav Matijevic. He was the leader of the local Ustašas in Kulen-Vakuf, and he was responsible for recruiting 110 other men from that town and several nearby Muslim and Catholic villages to join him in persecuting their Orthodox neighbors. Together, they robbed and killed as many as 700 people. Their violence set off a rebellion in this region, and some who joined sought revenge against all those who had attacked them. The violence of these insurgents culminated with the killing of about 2,000 people in Kulen-Vakuf in early September. Those killings cannot be explained without also recalling men like Miroslav Matijevic. And so the house we see here could have a monument on it to remind us how the region's violence actually began in 1941. If we were to turn back to the bridge and walk across it toward the plaque, we would emerge onto a winding road, which snakes to the left and then to the right, as you can see in this photo. After no more than 200 meters of walking, we would arrive to this place, which is the old police station in Kulen-Vakuf. It was here in September 1941 that a number of Serb insurgents who wished to fight the Ustašas, but who had no desire to kill innocent people, raised their weapons and stood guard as several hundred Muslim women and children hid inside. Other insurgents demanded that those guarding the women and children leave so that they could enter this building and kill them. But the guards refused and even raised and cocked their weapons and pointed them at the heads of their fellow insurgents. They saved hundreds of lives. A monument could be built here to remind us that ethnic categories do not determine human behavior, and that some people who were among the insurgents took great risks across the lines of ethnicity to save their neighbors. This building was razed to the ground in 2013 by a man who as a child survived the massacres in Kulen-Vakuf in September 1941. Here is what this site looks like now. If we now turned around and crossed the bridge where we began, and then turned right. We could walk about a kilometer to the center of Kulen-Vakuf, where we would see a white mosque with its minaret reaching for the sky. Just beyond it, to the right and to the left, we would arrive to the town's primary school, which is the large white building we see in this photograph right next to the playing fields. The original school was built by the Austro-Hungarian authorities in 1880 and was located to the right of the building you see here and up the hill. Above its entrance was written, quote, "Blind is the one who does not know how to read," end quote. It was in that school that during the summer of 1941, Miroslav Matejevich and the rest of the local Ustashas held their prisoners. And it was there that they came almost every night during July and August of that year to take a group to nearby ditches where they killed them. A monument could be built here to remind us that the attack on Kulen-Vakuf in September 1941 did not materialize out of thin air or because of this or that nationalism. It was the result of local Ustasha violence against the region's Orthodox population. Here is another picture of the school with an abandoned kiosk in front of it. A local man who was convicted for having been in Ustasha in 1941 sold newspapers here every day for decades after he was released from prison. If we continued walking along the road here and began climbing a dirt road upwards, we would soon arrive to a wooded area. An overgrown path leads in the direction of the abandoned Orthodox church in Kulen-Vakuf. Local Ustashas captured Orthodox villagers during the summer of 1941 and then killed them in ditches nearby this church. One of the victims was the church's priest, Father Vukosav Milanovic. He was well known in Kulen-Vakuf for having prevented a massacre of the local Muslim population in 1918 in the aftermath of the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. He met an armed group of Orthodox villagers as they approached the town. And he said, "If you have come here as liberators, then enter and you will be received warmly and well cared for. But if you have come to commit any kind of evil against our Muslim brothers, then I will call on my entire parish to rise up against you," end quote. A monument could be built here to remind us, once again, that the local violence did not begin in September 1941 with the insurgent massacres. It first swept hundreds of Orthodox villagers to their deaths, which is what led to those massacres in September 1941. And this monument could remind us that among the Orthodox victims were people like Father Milanovic, who had spent their lives working for and taking risks to protect interethnic coexistence. From the site of the abandoned Orthodox church, we can gaze down on Kulen-Vakuf, where we can see the town's houses. During the summer of 1941, many people living in the town took great risks to protect their Orthodox neighbors. They ran to their villages and warned people to flee to the forests when they knew that the town's Ustashas were planning an attack. And a number of people took the step of hiding survivors of massacres in their homes, sometimes for as long as several months. Thanks to these people, 59 of the town's 106 Orthodox residents survived the violence of 1941. Monuments could be built in the town in memory of those who chose to save their neighbors. Imagining this different kind of memorial landscape can help us reflect about what use monuments can have in the aftermath of intercommunal violence. And specifically, this imaginary landscape suggests that new ways of thinking about the violent past can emerge when we try to build monuments that promote mutually coexisting truths, and when we try to practice a just form of memory in which we recall not only our important memories, but also those of others. Doing so narrows the space available for silences and myths, both of which make reconciliation less likely in communities torn apart by the trauma of intercommunal violence. Of course, it's unlikely that any of these imaginary monuments will ever be built. For those who have suffered at the hands of their neighbors, it is often less painful to live in a world of myths and black and white categories. This approach is entirely understandable and should be respected, but it will not lead to reconciliation. For that delicate process to take root and to grow and potentially bloom, a deep change must take place inside those who live in the shadow of intercommunal violence. They need to begin seeing themselves and their neighbors as largely the same, as humans who are all extremely vulnerable to being hurt and who all have a terrifying capacity to hurt others. Thank you.